The rain hammered against the glass walls of Vanderbilt and Gray International, one of the tallest and most intimidating skyscrapers in Chicago. At the very top, in a boardroom big enough to hold a small wedding, the city's most powerful executives were finalizing a $300 million deal with overseas investors. Suits pressed, pens clicking, confidence radiating from every polished surface. Down the hall, in the shadow of all that power, Elena Cruz pushed her cleaning cart quietly over the carpeted floor. The soft hum of the vacuum was her shield against the reminders of where she was and where she wasn't. Most people in this building barely noticed her. To them, she was the woman in a faded navy uniform, hair pulled back tightly, hands always in motion. But Elena was more than what they saw. What they didn't know was that 6 years ago, Elena had been one of the top linguistics students at the University of Salamanca in Spain. Fluent in 4 languages, she had dreamed of becoming a translator for the United Nations. But when her father's small bakery in Chicago fell into debt and he grew ill, Elena dropped everything, moved back home, and took the first job she could get, scrubbing offices at night while sending money to keep the bakery alive. That night, as she passed the open door of the boardroom, a burst of laughter made her pause. Inside, Richard Vanderbilt, the CEO, stood with his arms crossed, grinning smugly at a printed document. He was a man whose presence seemed to absorb all the oxygen in the room, tall, silver-haired, and dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Elena made in 6 months. In his hand was a thick contract, printed in Mandarin Chinese. The team had been struggling with a section of it for over an hour, according to the whispers Elena had overheard. While emptying trash cans earlier, Richard noticed her in the doorway and smirked. "Cruz, isn't it?" he said, his voice carrying a mix of amusement and arrogance. "Tell me, do they teach you anything about international law when you're pushing a mop?" The room erupted in light chuckles. Elena's stomach tightened, but her eyes didn't drop. "No, sir," she replied evenly, "but I've read a bit about it." Oh, his eyebrows lifted, his tone dripping disbelief. "Well then, here's a little game. If you can translate this section perfectly, right here and now, I'll..." He paused, clearly searching for something outrageous enough to make the room laugh again. "I'll hire you, on the spot. Forget cleaning. Full salary, executive floor." The room went silent for a beat. The other executives exchanged amused glances. Richard leaned against the polished table, confident she would decline. Elena stepped forward. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden rush of possibility. She took the document gently, scanning the lines with the careful precision of someone who had lived in words all her life. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and steady. "This clause," she began, "says that the supplier has the right to terminate the agreement with no financial penalty if delivery is delayed beyond 30 days, which means you are about to sign away the company's only protection against a breach of contract worth hundreds of millions." The room went dead silent. Richard's smile faded. One of the senior lawyers snatched the paper from Elena's hands, eyes darting over the text. "She's right," he muttered, almost in disbelief. "This is a huge oversight." Richard's jaw tightened. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself. He looked at Elena as if really seeing her for the first time, and in that moment, a chain of events began, one that would take Elena from the forgotten shadows of the office to the very heart of a global storm. The room still felt frozen when Elena stepped back, her hands clasped in front of her. The only sound was the soft shuffle of papers as the senior lawyer reread the section she had just translated. Outside, rain streaked down the floor-to-ceiling windows, distorting the view of the city lights. Richard Vanderbilt stood perfectly still, the weight of the moment settling over him. He had built his career on never being caught off guard, but now, in front of his entire board and a group of foreign investors, the janitor he'd barely noticed had just saved his company from a potentially devastating mistake. One of the Mandarin-speaking investors leaned toward Richard and murmured something quietly. He responded with a forced smile, then turned back to Elena. "You've studied Chinese?" he asked, his tone softer now, though still skeptical. "I studied a lot of things before I took this job," Elena replied, her voice measured. She didn't elaborate. Let him wonder. The investors were whispering among themselves. Clearly impressed, the tension in the room shifted. What had started as an awkward joke was becoming something else entirely, something Richard couldn't quite control. He stepped closer, folding his arms. "You do realize," he said, "that what you just pointed out might have saved us from losing hundreds of millions." Elena's gaze didn't waver. "I realize you were about to sign it anyway." The quiet gasp from someone near the back told her she had just crossed an invisible line. But she didn't care. She had spent years swallowing her words. This moment felt like the first time she was breathing freely in years. Richard studied her for a long beat, his eyes calculating. Then, without breaking eye contact, he turned to one of the assistants. "Get her details," he ordered. "She's not going back to cleaning floors tonight." There was a ripple of surprise through the room. The assistant hesitated, as if unsure whether this was serious, but Richard's sharp glance confirmed it was no joke. Before Elena could process what had just happened, she was being ushered into a smaller adjoining office. The door clicked shut behind her. She stood alone in the dim light, hearing muffled voices from the boardroom. Her heart was pounding, but not from fear. Something had shifted, not just in the room she'd left, but in her life. The door opened again, and Richard walked in, the contract still in his hand. He placed it on the desk between them, but his eyes stayed fixed on her. "You're not just a janitor," he said, almost as if testing the words out loud. "No," Elena replied, "but you've never asked who I am." That answer seemed to interest him more than the translation itself. He sat, gesturing for her to do the same. She didn't move. "You could work here," he continued, "not as staff for cleaning, but as staff for operations. Maybe more. But I need to know, how do you know this language? And why are you here, in that uniform?" She considered telling him the truth about her father, the bakery, and the years she'd spent quietly letting her dreams collect dust. But something about the way he watched her told her this was not the time to give away all her secrets. "Instead," she said, "maybe you'll find out if you give me the job." It was a risk, a dangerous one, but Richard only smiled faintly, the first genuine smile she had seen from him all night. "You've got nerve," he said finally. "Let's see if you can survive here, starting tomorrow." Elena didn't thank him. She only nodded, because deep down, she knew this wasn't a gift. It was a test, and in this building, a test could either be the first step toward everything she'd ever wanted, or the quickest way to lose it all. What she didn't know yet was that someone else in that boardroom had been watching her very closely, and that person had plans for her that would make tonight's surprise look like nothing at all. Elena barely slept that night, every time she closed her eyes, she saw the boardroom again, the gleam of the polished table, the surprise on the investors' faces, the way Richard Vanderbilt had studied her like she was a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. By morning, the city was still gray from the night storm. The bakery downstairs from her apartment smelled of fresh bread, but she barely noticed as she hurried to the towering glass building. That now felt different, no longer a place she just cleaned, but a place where she might belong. When she stepped inside, security didn't wave her toward the service elevator as usual. Instead, a woman in a sharp navy suit was waiting at the lobby desk with a small clipboard. "Elena Cruz?" the woman asked. "Yes, Mr. Vanderbilt asked me to bring you up." Her voice was polite, but her eyes flicked over Elena's simple clothes with a trace of doubt. They rode the executive elevator in silence, the hum of machinery the only sound between them. When the doors opened, Elena stepped out into a space she had never seen before, thick carpeting that muted every footstep, walls lined with modern art, and glass offices with sweeping views of the Chicago skyline. At the far end, Richard was waiting. He wasn't alone. Sitting in one of the guest chairs was a man Elena didn't recognize, tall, lean, with dark hair slicked neatly back, and eyes that seemed to measure everything at once. "Elena," Richard said, motioning her forward. "This is Adrian Cole, our head of international strategy." Adrian rose to shake her hand, his grip firm but cool. "I saw what you did last night," he said. Very impressive. Something in his tone made her stomach tighten. It wasn't admiration. It was closer to curiosity mixed with calculation. Richard gestured to the chair opposite them. Adrian's going to give you your first assignment. Think of it as an introduction to how we do things here. Adrian slid a thin folder across the table toward her. She opened it to find another contract. This one in Arabic. Simple translation, Adrian said, though there was a faint smirk at the corner of his mouth. But we'd like your notes on any potential risks. Elena's eyes scanned the text. She knew Arabic, not perfectly, but well enough. She could feel both men watching her closely, and not just for the translation. This was a test. She worked silently, jotting quick notes in the margins, circling phrases that could be ambiguous, underlining clauses that might lead to disputes. The longer she wrote, the heavier the air in the room felt. When she finally pushed the folder back, Adrian flipped through her notes without looking up. Not bad, he said at last. But you missed something. He tapped the page with one finger. Here, the payment schedule. They've worded it in a way that allows them to delay indefinitely without breaching the contract. That's the kind of thing we need to catch. Elena's jaw tightened. He was right, but she could tell from the way he delivered the criticism that he wanted her to feel small. I'll remember that, she said simply. Adrian closed the folder, his expression unreadable. Good, because here, one missed detail can end a career before it starts. Richard rose from his seat, signaling the meeting was over. We'll see how you do in the coming weeks, Cruz. This place rewards skill and punishes mistakes. As Elena walked back toward the elevator, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass wall. She didn't look like the janitor they had met last night, but she also didn't look like she belonged here yet. What she didn't see was Adrian, watching her go, his fingers tapping lightly against the folder. He wasn't just testing her for the company. He had his own reasons and his own agenda for wanting to know exactly how much she could do. By the time Elena reached the ground floor, an uneasy truth had settled in her mind. Getting into this world had been the first battle. Surviving it was going to be the war. The first week in her new role felt like stepping onto a moving train. No time to settle. No chance to catch her breath. Elena's days were filled with stacks of documents, phone calls in languages most of the staff couldn't pronounce, and quiet glances from people who still remembered her in a janitor's uniform. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with thinly veiled resentment. Adrian Cole was never far. He seemed to appear in doorways, without sound, handing her files with polite but clipped instructions. He rarely complimented her work, yet he never ignored her progress either. If anything, he seemed to be pushing her harder than anyone else. On Friday afternoon, just as Elena was packing up, Adrian appeared at her desk. Walk with me, he said. She followed him through a maze of hallways until they reached a corner conference room with tinted windows. Inside, a single folder sat in the center of the table. This, Adrian said, tapping the folder, is not a typical assignment. It's a proposal from a partner company overseas. It's in Russian. I need you to translate it and prepare a risk summary. But there's one condition. You can't mention it to Vanderbilt. Elena blinked. Why not? Adrian smiled faintly, as if the question amused him. Because sometimes information needs to be filtered before it reaches certain people. She didn't like the sound of that. Every instinct told her there was more to this than he was admitting. But the folder sat between them like a dare. Will you take it or not? Adrian asked. Her fingers brushed the edge of the folder. I'll take it. Back at her desk, she began reading. The language was straightforward, but buried in the middle section was a clause that made her pause. A clause that would allow the partner company to claim ownership over any joint developments. In other words, if Vanderbilt and Gray entered into this agreement, they could lose control over their own intellectual property. By the time she finished her notes, it was late. Most of the office was empty. She slid the folder back into her bag and rode the elevator down, her mind heavy with questions. Why would Adrian want to keep this from Richard? And why give it to her at all when she stepped out into the cool night air? A black sedan was idling at the curb. The back window rolled down, and Richard's voice cut through the hum of traffic. Going somewhere. Cruz, she froze. He was leaning back in the seat, his expression unreadable. Get in, he said. Inside, the car smelled faintly of leather and cologne, Richard studied her in the dim light. "You've been busy," he said. "I hear Adrian gave you something special." Her heart pounded. "Did he tell you?" "No. I make it my business to know." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Whatever he's doing, you'd be wise to remember. This firm is full of people who play their own games. And if you choose the wrong side, it won't matter how smart you are. You'll be gone." The car stopped in front of her apartment. She stepped out, the door closing softly behind her. As the sedan pulled away, Elena stood on the sidewalk, the city buzzing around her. Two powerful men were watching her every move, each with their own motives. And she was caught between them, holding a secret that could tip the balance. She didn't know yet that the choice she made with that Russian contract would not only decide her future at Vanderbilt and Gray, it would decide who stayed in power and who lost everything. Elena didn't touch the Russian contract all weekend, but it never left her mind. She kept replaying Richard's warning in the car and Adrian's cryptic instructions in the conference room. By Sunday night, the folder was sitting on her kitchen table like it was watching her, daring her to make a choice. By Monday morning, she knew there was no safe way to play this. If she gave the report only to Adrian, she risked becoming part of whatever he was hiding. If she went to Richard directly, she risked losing the man who had opened the first real door for her. When she arrived at the office, Adrian was already waiting by her desk. "Did you finish?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "I did," she said, keeping her voice steady. He held out his hand. She hesitated just long enough for him to notice before placing the folder in his grasp. He opened it, scanning quickly. "You found the ownership clause," he said, as if it were a minor detail. "Good, that's what I needed." "And what happens now?" she asked. "That," he replied, "closing the folder is not something you need to worry about." Then he turned and walked away. But Elena did worry. The more she thought about it, the more she was sure Adrian had no intention of warning anyone else. By lunchtime, she'd made up her mind. She would tell Richard. She waited until late afternoon, when the executive floor was quieter, then knocked on the glass door of Richard's office. He looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "You have something for me, Cruz?" "Yes," she said, stepping inside. "It's about the Russian proposal." For the next few minutes, she explained the ownership clause, her findings, and the fact that Adrian had asked her to keep it from him. Richard listened without interrupting, his hands folded in front of him. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. "You realize," he said slowly, "that by telling me this, you've just put yourself in the middle of a fight you don't fully understand." "I didn't come here to play politics," she replied. "I came here to work, but I'm not going to pretend I didn't see a problem." Something flickered in his eyes, approval, maybe, or respect. "Leave it with me," he said at last, "and Cruz, don't mention this conversation to anyone." She left his office with her pulse racing. She had done the right thing, she told herself, but deep down, she knew this wasn't over. The next morning, the building was buzzing with whispers. Adrian wasn't in his office. His assistant said he'd been called into an urgent meeting with the board. By noon, the rumors were swirling. The Russian deal had been suspended, and some were saying Adrian's position was under review. When Elena went to the break room for coffee, two senior associates were speaking in hushed tones. They stopped. When she walked in, their eyes following her as she poured her cup. It wasn't hard to guess why. That evening, as she packed up her things, her phone buzzed. No name, just a number she didn't recognize. You think you know who to trust. You don't. Be careful. Her hand tightened around the phone. She glanced toward the darkened hallway, a chill crawling up her spine. Whoever had sent that message knew what she'd done, and they weren't finished with her yet. Elena stared at the message on her phone until the screen dimmed. The words burned into her mind. She didn't know if it was a threat, a warning, or both. The hallway outside her office was quiet. Too quiet, and every sound seemed sharper than usual. The distant hum of the air conditioner, the faint click of heels somewhere far off. When she stepped into the elevator, she caught her reflection in the mirrored wall. For a moment, she hardly recognized herself. She wasn't the woman who pushed a cleaning cart anymore, but she wasn't entirely sure who she was becoming. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with a mug of tea growing cold, flipping her phone over in her hands, wondering who had sent the message. Adrian was the obvious suspect, but the tone felt different, less direct, more calculated. By morning, she decided to confront him. When she arrived, his office door was closed, but she could hear voices inside. She lingered in the hallway just long enough to catch fragments of conversation. Adrian's voice was low, but urgent. "She's not as naive as you think. If we keep her here, she's going to start asking the wrong questions." Another voice answered, one she didn't recognize. "Then make sure she's not here much longer." Her pulse hammered in her ears. She moved away before the door opened, slipping into the stairwell. It was suddenly clear. Adrian wasn't just trying to control the Russian contract. He was trying to get rid of her. She could have gone to Richard immediately. But something stopped her. If Adrian was working with someone else inside the firm, then simply reporting him might not be enough. She needed proof, undeniable proof, before she made her move. That proof came sooner than she expected. Later that afternoon, a junior analyst stopped by her desk, dropping off a misdelivered folder. Inside were emails, dozens of them, between Adrian and a foreign contact, discussing terms that mirrored the Russian proposal, but under a private shell company's name. It was clear what they were doing, trying to cut Vanderbilt and Gray out of the deal entirely, then sell the assets back at a massive profit. Her heart pounded as she copied the documents onto a flash drive and slipped it into her pocket. She knew she was holding something dangerous, the kind of information that could ruin careers. Or worse. By the time she reached Richard's office, he was on the phone. She closed the door behind her and set the flash drive on his desk without a word. He ended the call, looking at her with a calm she couldn't read. "Adrian's been busy," she said, her voice low. "And he's not working alone." Richard turned the drive over in his hand, then leaned back in his chair. "Do you know what you've just done?" "I've made a choice," she replied. A slow smile spread across his face. "Then you've just won yourself a seat at the table, Cruz. But you should know, that table isn't as safe as it looks." 2 days later, Adrian was gone. Officially, it was a mutual separation. Unofficially, everyone knew it was more than that. The whispers followed Elena wherever she went, some curious, some hostile. That evening, Richard called her into his office. He stood by the window, the city lights glittering far below. "You handled yourself well," he said. "Better than most here would have." "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, turning to face her, "you decide how far you want to go. Because this firm, this world, will give you everything you've ever dreamed of, but it will take just as much in return." As she walked out of his office, Elena knew she had stepped into a world where loyalty was currency. Trust was rare, and survival depended on knowing when to speak and when to keep quiet. She had come in as a janitor, invisible to everyone. Now she was part of the game, and in this game, there were no second chances. Somewhere deep down, she knew this was only the beginning.